Thank you very much. Yes, I'm going to wave some books at you because I'm proud of them. I'm Professor Simon Grennan here at the University of Chester. Actually, I'm much older than so I've been in practice since properly in public since 1990, and I'm just going to wave a couple of things at you. I am author of a technical book about narrative drawing, the study of storytelling drawings, called Theory of Narrative Drawing. I work on the work of Mary Duval to revive her, 1870s London cartoonist and actress, along with a number of other folks. I'm a comics guy, key terms in comic studies. Graphic novels, Dispossession, which is the first adaptation of one of the later novels of Anthony Trollope. Exciting. And Drawing in Drag by Mary Duval, where actually I drew as though I was Mary Duval, 19th century cartoonist, revived in Manchester in 2019. And then most recently, thinking about drawing, little book, which should have been a short introduction to from Oxford, but they didn't think that my status was high enough, so I had to go to Bloomsbury. So today I'm going to kind of rattle through a number of things, and I'm going to talk about time and visual storytelling. And I make no apologies for the fact that as a keynote, this is going to be pretty intense. And so no apologies for that, but as Bette Davis says in All About Eve, strap yourself in. It's going to be a bumpy ride. Yeah. Excellent. So here we go. Existing analysis of our experience of utterances appear so mired in the wealth of data that constitute each specific condition of one medium or another, writing, drawing, film, as to militate against systematization. This wealth of data is often approached according to verbal language principles perceptual and cognitive principles, or even neurological principles these days, in which utterance is frequently theorized as an object. For the purpose of this keynote, I'd like to propose that in the sense that things are meaningful to us, there are no objects, only behavior. I will return to this idea in the second half of my talk when I discuss some of the ways in which we might think of drawing as utterance. On the basis that there are no objects, only behavior, I ask if it's possible to systematize the relationships between subjects that constitute narrative discourse. That is, to systematize types of behavior in making and experiencing narrative utterances. A systematic model of narrative discourse would constitute terms of analysis, that is, elements applicable in every case. This is a system in which every element is epistemologically independent. We know one thing, we know another, and in which it is not possible to omit any element without breaking the system. Although the systemic terms of analysis of the relationships between any behavior are possibly infinite, I've limited my terms of analysis to a single corollary of every behavior, particularly for this conference: time. I admit that this is sheer sleight of hand. Concepts of time supervene upon indices of change. There is no time, only indices of time. However, this elision is useful in so much as it allows us to consider the relationships between times indexed by different behavior as a shorthand for the relationship between the types of behavior themselves, making things very simple. Narrative is an experience of a number of different coexisting and independent times, which act in specific ways to create a network of intersubjective relationships between people and their expressive actions. Artists, teachers, students, according to musicologist Carolyn Abate, who I like very much. To identify these different times requires that we keep motive and embodied subjects always in view. We can't objectify each subject. We must resist the tendency in everyday speech to simply conflate narrative with types of content, and thus fall into the error of objectifying what a story is. When we make representations for another person, the object of these representations inhabits a distinct time. The story time, this is a narratological term, is brought into being by everything that is explicitly represented, or in Chapman's words, Seymour Chapman, the great narratologist's words, what is told or shown relative to the way in which it's told and shown, following Genette's story discourse model, and this is classical narratology from the late 20th century. Following Venn, 1880, I like the 19th century too, let's start to represent the time of the story as an element in a temporal system, in which overlapping enclosed areas, Venn diagram, represent causal, consequential, that is aetiological, not just teleological, but aetiological relationships, beginning with an enclosed area titled, well, story. Like this. Nice little, actually it's good. So happy to be here. As knowledge, this is an epistemological model, remember, of time. As knowledge, this story time exists in a wider diegetic frame of other temporal events, because the world in the time of the story also has both implied antecedents, things that have gone on before, and an implied future, even though these remain untold and or unshown. Think of, Nelson Goodman writes, think of Nelson Goodman writing, a picture of a forest tells implicitly of trees growing from seedlings, shedding leaves, dying and disappearing. Although this past and future of the story are not represented, they are as specific as the object of representation. These necessary causalities exist in a different time from the time of the story because they're not told or shown. Although untold, this time, the past and future of the representation itself, constitutes the complete worlds that exist for the story to occur. We could call these untold worlds the pre-story, if you like, or the post-story, occurring in story time, if we are careful not to confuse the term story with M.L. Bonvenist's famous narratological 1970s definition of story, which describes both what is told or shown and how it is told and shown. Also, the unrepresented pre-story and post-story required by the story is not another story because it's never shown. Whereas the world of the story is absolutely fixed through the process of representation, showing or telling, the world of the pre-story and post-story is the world of all possibilities, communicative resources or affordances, conjured alone by the epistemological demands of the story itself. We can add pre and post story as another distinct element in the system. I'm making a Venn diagram, remember, representing its aetiological, cause and consequences, relationship to the story with an overlap like this. Hurrah. Now we've got a grin, teeth, nice. We understand that characters in comics, for example, do not see the world in which they act as a world made of ink and paper, but as a complete afforded world. This understanding of story coherence is known as verisimilitude, or verisimilitude of the represented world. According to Paul Copley, it's a principle of textual coherence, making the story make sense, rather than an area in which there exists some relation between what is fictional and what is non-fictional. In my emerging system, my Venn diagram, we understand that the times of the pre-story, post-story, and story always take place in the past, relative to the time in which the representation is made. The act of utterance and its object, what's represented, cannot exist in the same time as the story. The very telling of the story makes it a world of the past in relation to the act of telling or showing. The story in its pre-story and post-story are always recently told. Identifying that the pre-story, post-story, and story are temporarily distinct from the time in which each utterance is made creates one of the central relationships in my emerging Venn diagram. The narrator is entirely brought to our knowledge in our experience of the utterance, how the story is shown or told, distinct from what is shown or told, uttered. In relation to the past times of the pre-story, post-story, and story, the narrator's time always exists in the present, in the immediate time in which an utterance is perceived, not necessarily made, but perceived. It's characterized by the specific enunciative techniques used by the narrator. Rembrandt makes a painting, I don't know, Spielberg makes a movie, I talk today. These techniques constitute the material form of utterance. They are the wide range of media that we employ to make ourselves understood, from co-present embodiment, hi, on one hand, to emails on the other. Hence, the narrator's subjectivity comprises the technological characteristics of the medium in which the utterance is made. Still occupying a single temporal position in my emerging system, the narrator's trace might have been made by many people. The narrator is not a person, or by a single person. The narrator is no longer necessarily identified with the body of a single person. With most media, we are more likely than not encountering the traces of many bodies as narrator. We also need to add narrator's time in another distinct element in my Venn diagram. Hurrah. Most frequently, the traces that constitute the narrator in a specific narrator time communicate when the bodies of people who have made them are no longer present. I made this drawing, here I am today, but if I go away, here it is, trace of me. For this to be achieved, all that they require is for a viewing reader, or indeed viewer, listener, to perceive that their traces are meaningful. The viewing reader also occupies a distinct temporal position in our emerging system of narrative relationships. Specific physical resources characterize the subjective viewing reader, I'm calling them, as well as the narrator, bringing into being another distinct time. The time of viewing or reading or consuming, if you like, is not the same as the narrator time. The viewing reader's resource is only the technological trace left by the body or bodies of the narrator. This trace provides the only way in which the viewing reader can know that the narrator is a subject at all. Someone is telling and showing something, some subject, some function, in fact, if I'm speaking structurally. The subjectivity of the viewing reader is created moment by moment by the infinite techniques of viewing or reading. The time of viewing and reading creates knowledge of all the other times in our narrative system. Here's the time of the reader in our Venn diagram. So you can't get to the narrator except through the reader. You can't get to the story except through narration. You can't get to the pre-story and the post-story except through the story. I love Venn. Venn's so useful. Really, really gorgeous. Okay. Although narrator time, belonging only to material trace, encompasses the whole utterance, the whole representation, the painting, the piece of music, the whatever, we also understand that the utterance has been produced itself. As much as there is a distinction between the time of what is uttered and the time of the utterance, there's also a distinction between the time of production and the time of the utterance. Narrator time does not obscure or elide a final subject necessary in this system. And you'll be pleased that this is the final part of this Venn diagram, because, you know, I can go on and on. The author and the narrator cannot exist in the same time unless their distinct identities are entirely synchronized in a direct act of embodied expression, in co-presence with other people, like now. Author and narrator have different epistemological relationships to the other temporal positions in the system, and these appear clearly in types of communication made through technological trace, almost everything. Authors are still frequently identified as sole omniscient motivators of the physical traces of their own and others' bodies. But this is hardly ever true. Who made the machine that I'm talking to you with? Who made it? There's thousands and thousands of people back into time. Every representation bears the traces of all of its contributing producers. In this model, an author is both a function and a subject, but is not a human subject, certainly not a single human subject. The time of the author, rather in the manner of the pre-story and the post-story, can only be known relative to the time of the narrator. It's impossible to know anything about the author other than it exists. As Gerard Genet, again, great narratologist, writes, behind the explicit image of the narrator, I construct as well as I can the author. The author is only known to readers through the subjectivity of the narrator. Finally, here's the time of the author represented in relation to the other times in our Venn diagram. Excellent. In this system, story is wholly subsumed. This is a summary of the model. Story is wholly subsumed by pre-story and post-story. The time of the former cannot appear without the times of the latter. although they represent distinct temporal conditions. They're not the same as each other. The time of the narrator is constituted by the medium of expression, which is the physical means by which the utterance is achieved. The time in which the narrator exists encompasses both story and pre-story and post-story. However, the pre-story and post-story lie outside the time of the narrator because they're not told or shown. Both the subjective time of the author and the subjective time of the reader, viewer, overlap with narrator time. They are only related to each other through the means of representation, that is, the narrator. The systematic relationships that have emerged through this consideration of time also constitute relations between different subjects and different elements or terms of analysis. And we've all done this. We undertake analysis of narratives through reading. We try to reach an idea of the, who knows, sometimes the biographical idea about the author through the narrative. We speculate about the material culture of the world of Jane Eyre, pre-story, etc., etc. Under this system, it's theoretically impossible to reify, isolate, or objectify the utterance, or indeed to analyze utterances, any type of utterance in any medium, without analyzing the relationships between the behavior through which utterances are made and understood. So, end of part one. Thank goodness for that. Please bear that in mind. It's a commonplace of studies of drawing from practical manuals instructing in particular drawing traditions through scholarly analysis to identify early the focus of study, what drawing is, with types of technical activity and their histories. Even those studies that undertake a philosophical criticism of drawing, as Patrick Maynard describes his own study, very, very influentially, largely concern themselves with the investigation of the ways in which different arrays of perceived effects and the environmental and cognitive systems that support their production and perception are evidenced in the material technologies of existing drawings. Oh, you can recognize how it was made. If you make a line like this, the viewer will feel that. That's teaching manuals. This way of thinking about drawing proposes that the drafter selects from a number of possible technological actions productive of marks in drawing, and that these possibilities are produced as a selection from a wide range of devices, that is, technical activities, as though choosing tools from a toolkit. According to this theoretical approach, which is absolutely foundational and which we are all involved in still, according to this theoretical approach, the objects of these studies of drawing are the technical elements of the formal arrays of the drawing, what the marks do, where they sit, what the materials are, identified through instances of repetition and considered as components. You know, art history says, or connoisseurship even says, that I can recognize a Rembrandt because I recognize the arrays of mark as being repeated again and again, and they have a particular effect, i.e. the effects of genius, on my body. I feel it though. Rembrandt's awesome. Nothing wrong with Rembrandt. Yeah, so this approach brings with it a number of serious problems if we are attempting to describe what drawing is, and particularly make a case for drawing as utterance in the terms of the epistemological system of narrative that I've just outlined. Here are some of the problems. Technical activity accounts, that's the formal idea of like, oh, you make the mark, it makes me feel. Technical activity accounts of drawing cannot really, well, A, describe different drawings relative to purpose. This problem is amply exemplified in the presence of stylistic distinctions. And I'm going to come back to this list of problems, so I'm going to go through them one by one in a moment. But stylistic distinctions, what's the problem? How is it that a drawing of a pine tree by Cézanne, made in the 19th century, and a drawing of a pine tree made by Marlin in the 13th century are technically so different, so contradictory in facture, yet both are drawings of pine trees? Also, that's a good question, bear that in mind. Technical activity accounts of drawing can't account for the occurrence of new ways of doing things, novel activities. What's the status of an activity or mark that isn't on the existing menu of technical effects? Technical activity accounts of drawing can't account for failure. It's easy to agree, I mean, I know this for a fact, it's easier to agree that more drawings fail than succeed. Mine certainly do. Yeah. How can this be so when drawing is simply the task of producing an effective combination of available visual technical choices? Technical activity accounts of drawing can't account for the very obvious differences between what one experiences a drawing and what one perceives elsewhere. However, problems resulting from thinking about drawing as technical activity, that is, the manipulation of a technical toolkit, do not arise at all when we describe drawing etiologically as causes and consequences. I here propose an etiological approach to drawing that substantiates my epistemological structure of narrative. It's a small step to infer causes and consequences from the temporally tagged functions in my narrative system, story, narrator, pre-story, describing what can and cannot be known. The relationship between temporal functions itself describes possibilities and impossibilities that constitute in themselves motives and prohibitions. So, if I see a woman draw a mark across a piece of paper in order to make a drawing, I also see the purpose or goal for her drawing the mark. Since describing her activity as drawing suggests that she's making a mark in order to make a drawing, the description itself can be thought of offering an explanation for her actions in order to make a drawing. The relationship between goal and activity itself offers an explanation of both behavior and the phenomenon, the drawing. This relationship is not only causal, however. Trying to make a drawing has both consequences as well as causes. That is, it can be considered etiologically. In fact, the marking activities undertaken by a woman with the goal of making a drawing are undertaken precisely because they have consequences. Why would you make a drawing if you didn't want something to happen after? So, purpose then, novel activities, new ways of doing things. Because activities undertaken in order to make a drawing encompass a very broad range indeed, as we know, an etiological characterization allows the spontaneous appearance of novel activities, marks, and combinations. For example, a woman makes a new mark in order to achieve a particular drawing. If the particular drawing is produced and her goal is achieved, the new activity mark immediately evidences the capacity for which it was made, even though the activity and the mark doesn't belong to any category of activity previously seen to produce this effect. It's novel. Failure, a nice green there. Corrosive, kind of slightly acidic. There are many ways in which an activity can fail to reach its goal while still being goal-directed. No problem there. A technical activity description, formalism, of drawing seeks examples of congruence between types of marks identified in existing drawings, identifying successful instances of goal reaching in the form of achieved perceptual effects. Oh yes, that's a Rembrandt. I'm feeling Rembrandtiness in the drawing because I've seen Rembrandtiness in another Rembrandt drawing. And in fact, if I build a corpus of Rembrandt drawings, what do I have? Rembrandt. Excellent. However, failure to make a drawing by marking a piece of paper structures both past and future activities. The concept of revision itself evidences the productive role of failure in goal-oriented activity. I've tried it, I've failed, but in fact, that's what's going on. Failure produces revision as a constitutive type of goal orientation. Finally, in looking at a drawing, I might think that I'm seeing the causes and consequences of the activities and marks themselves. But my seeing the activity and my seeing the drawing are not the same. In fact, it is the inference of a cause that is meaningful to me, rather than the cause itself. According to a technical activity approach to drawing, however, perceptual effects are completely conflated with their means. It claims, the technical activity approach, that a woman makes a particular type of mark because that type of mark produces a particular perceptual effect. Distinctions between mark and effect are considered unimportant in technical activity theorizations, because the activity of trying to make a drawing constitutes selecting known technical elements to produce expected formal arrays as in a toolkit. Of course, etiological characterizations come with their own problems, of course. Three broad objections could be made to this summary as a theorization of the conditions of goal-oriented activity in general. Here they are. Goals change. Oh no. The first objection concerns the simple observation that similar activities might be directed towards one goal on one occasion and towards another on another occasion, thus potentially undermining the idea that particular types of activities can be characterized by their achieved goals. The same activity can be directed towards the achievement of many different results. Problem. The second objection observes that a number of different activities can achieve the same goal, raising the same question in a different form, by undermining the idea that particular types of achieved goals can be characterized by types of activities that try to achieve them. Oh, sorry, it's too early, isn't it? However, this isn't true. Goals themselves define the activities needed to achieve them. In that any activity that is required to achieve a specific goal is an activity directed towards that goal. In response to the first objection, that goals can change, I can find examples of the same type of mark employed in trying to achieve very different goals. Look at the single diagonal mark establishing a shadow in Pisanello's four unrelated figures on the left here. So let's have a look at it. Choose any mark, the shadow mark. Compare that to the visible edge of a man's tunic in Pisanello's drawing Two Men Standing, which is on the right, both made between 1415 and 1455. One mark on the left depicts an absence of light. Its goal is the depiction of an absence of light. Excellent, well done, Pisanello, awesome. Whereas the other depicts a material edge. They are identical marks. Very, very different goals. So, consider the second objection. The different activities can achieve the same goal, even within the small degrees of difference that identify activity marks with the goal of producing a specific type of drawing. A range of types of activity marks are evidenced in trying to achieve virtually identical goals in each drawing, such as Pisanello trying to draw the weight of two adult men, for example. There they are. Third objection. Interrupted and postponed activities. I'm almost done. A third objection observes that goal-directed activities that are either interrupted or postponed endanger etiological characterizations. Causes and consequences get upset. You can't really understand. It all becomes a bit of a mess. By upsetting any evidential relationship between them, between causes and consequences. If activities are undertaken because they have a tendency to produce a particular result in given circumstances, how can I infer anything from activities that are not completed and that do not achieve their goal? Consider Rembrandt's ink drawing, a studio with an artist painting a double portrait made between 1645 and 1650. It's a good example of a situation evidencing interruption. It's a depiction. We see ink on paper, Rembrandt's drawing, at the same time as we see ourselves seeing the studio and the characters. And that's Richard Volheim. However, there are large areas of, oh my goodness, indeterminacy in the depiction. Both depiction and the marks appear incomplete because depiction is not sustained in some areas. You don't know what's going on, kind of drifts off. It could be this, it could be that. I see marks, but I do not see an object of depiction in them, in parts of the drawing. The drawing exemplifies an interrupted, goal-directed activity. I infer that Rembrandt was trying to make a particular type of depictive drawing, but in some area of the drawing, his activity was interrupted and another result was achieved. Because drawing activities in particular require making distinctions between types of action and types of mark to this acute degree, I can intuit the possibilities of theorizing topics that have become central to studies of drawing, such as orthographic inference, subjectivity, and style. Etiological identification of goal-directedness is a diagnostic tool that offers both a dialogic and systematic way to explain technical activity relative to purpose and the inference of purpose, without limiting explanation to elisions of function and perceptual effects technically identified in most cases. The identification of purpose realizes a conception of both utility, the use to which a drawing is put, as a cause and consequence of the activities that achieve it, and the existence of a plan for its use when it's done. An attempt to, or while it's being done, an attempt to make a drawing is further modulated by a draftsperson's own perception of both their activities in trying to make a drawing and the drawing itself. They perceive their own activities and the results according to the purpose of the drawing. Anyone who's made a drawing understands how that works. You struggle to make the drawing, you achieve the drawing to some degree, you revise the drawing. Both of these ideas require dialogic conception of a complete systemic ecology, in terms of which they attempt to make a drawing. I attempt to make a drawing. Here I argue for, of course, my epistemological model of narrative, my Venn diagram, as a useful conception of this complete ecology, which avoids objectification and reification of the drawing, because all of these subject times are in play. So, Gerard Prince, great verbal narratologist of the 70s, described the possibilities of an aetiological description of narrative in the sense that narrative can be any type of representative action made in order to tell, show a story. The study of causes and consequences also neatly makes a distinction between the organizing principles of a story and the structure of narrative itself, i.e. its subjects, its narrator, its author, its post-story, its pre-story. This model of the structure of narrative, which constitutes someone making a representative action, the trace itself, the mark itself, say, and someone perceiving themselves perceiving both, begs and answers a number of questions about utterance, not currently described, really, by theorists of drawing. Thank you. Do we have a, is there a chair for me, or do I have to field my own questions? Do we have time for some questions? Oh, I'm away from the...
Two. Do you want to chair this, Carol?
Yes and no. I'm happy to. Any questions for Simon?
Where's the coffee?
Yes.
Can people just say who you are briefly as well?
Hi, I'm Georgia Naish. I was going to ask what makes you consider when a drawing has failed?
I think that in terms of goal directedness, if you think, if we're making a drawing, so do you make drawings? Yeah. And so when we're making a drawing, we have an idea about how the activity produces itself in terms of both how we're thinking about it and how our body might produce it, or bodies might produce it. And so there is a notion, however unstated or unself-conscious it might be, that there is a goal. But the goal is a tricky thing, and so failure is. So one of the problems with the technical activity theorization is that goals are either met or they're not. Whereas actually drawing is much more about producing a change in the situation. And so the change itself kind of comes to an end, and that's a decision-making process that as drafters we understand. When is a drawing finished? And so failed drawings, so in fact, almost certainly, I think in my experience of drawing, yeah, almost all of my drawings are failed drawings because the production changes the terms in which I'm adjudicating their goal. And so as I'm drawing, I'm thinking and feeling and making. And so actually, and this is not accounted for by the notion of I don't know, stylistic consistency, say in an art historical way. Yeah, so the interesting thing about messing, for example, with stylistic kind of change, and so you say, okay, I'm going to adopt the manner of as a drafter. And so say I want to make a drawing like Rembrandt, and so I adopt Rembrandt. I study and I see the craft. And of course, the thing is that I'm not Rembrandt. So any drawing that I make is not a Rembrandt. And it doesn't matter what it's like. So we get into these situations where the relationship between the bodily traces of mind start to become quite complicated. And within all of that is failure. Yeah. So I think that the situation produces itself. Drawings redefine their goals to the point where they're about changing the situation. And so who knows? So you think, actually, maybe you just think, oh, I'm bored.
Personal criteria.
I think that well, no, not necessarily. I mean, if we work as drafters, say for instance, let's have a thing. If I'm a mangaka working in a manga studio, then there's a very, very specific idea of how I'm going to fail, and someone's going to fire me if I do, because I need to make a number of pages per day, per hour, and they need to look like that, and therefore that type of drawing is a very straightforward. Yeah, but what isn't accounted for or valued or even thought about under those circumstances is how each drawing changes the world in which the drawing is made, because it's new. It has no value in terms of the manga. That has no value at all. What we want is something similar, and if it's similar enough, it's a success.
Hi, Sophie Leach, NSCAD. I'm thinking about your Venn diagram. Go back to that. Effectively, you've got 5 circles. Society and our perception of drawings through lenses of society. And I can't think of the 20 years of parent-teacher evenings. Many people say, I can't draw.
Yeah.
The sense of failure. Would society be right round your Venn diagram? Or...
Yeah, I think that the diagram is there are one of the flaws in my diagram. There are a number of flaws in the diagram, and it's quite old already. And so I'm like, oh no, I shouldn't have done that. So one of the flaws in the diagram is that I think implicitly I'm still focusing on. I'm still pretending that that I know what the boundaries to the utterance are. And so that's and therefore how does one? So so in a sense, at the center of gravity of the diagram is still this maybe old-fashioned idea of the interpersonal rather than the pansocial. And so you think, well, okay, but I could kind of account for that in terms of thinking about the relationship between reading practices, viewing practices, and authorship, because the author. So if I think about, let me have what it's called. If I think about the production of culture model, that's about legal framework, how you get stuff made, how much people are paid, what the unionization is, what the social conditions are in terms of the relationships between, I don't know, genders and races and class. If I think of that cultural production model, then the weight of that analysis rests on the author-reader relationship. It doesn't sit with the narrative, and so that's potentially a flaw.
Can I ask a question? Sorry. As you said, we're all kind of invested historically in the kind of toolbox model, pedagogically as well.
I think.
How might we teach drawing differently using your proposed model?
Well, I mean, we could rewrite the paper as a teaching tool. I don't know. I think that's a really massive question, because we're invested in thinking, and this again comes back to your certain notion about society, is that objectification is so ingrained in the way in which we think about our experience and our subjectivity and our bodies, that it's a really excuse me, it's a really difficult thing to do. So how does one inculcate a dialogic a dialogic model when actually one thinks that red is red, and that a red thing is what I'm perceiving as red, Mary is also perceiving as red. How does one determine that I've no idea. It's a hard question. So I think that there are big questions, pedagogic questions about consensus and training. And so the notion that I can't draw, it's a big still, all the time. But then in a sense, you see, there's a notion about the craft of drawing that this all plays into, because I think it's okay for somebody to say, I can't make a chair. Mm-hmm. Because there's a recognition that there's not the ineffable in making a chair. Making a chair is craft, and drawing is also craft. This is theory. There are lots of folks. Patrick Maynard would say, no, this is nonsense, Simon. Actually, what we're talking about here is learning how to make a chair, and then leaving your chairness on the chair for other folks to recognise through repetition, because you made 40 of them, that you're the chair maker. And that's, I find that difficult. I mean, there's lots of ways we get ourselves into trouble, because storytelling, there are still folks out there who think that single images don't show stories, because there's not sequence. But of course there is sequence, and there is the past, and there is the future. There's a bundle of different times in a representation that is apparently still. So the thing, the object, the reified object, is stripped of its dialogic associations, its production of culture model, so that we can just focus on it as a product that we can consume. And overturning that is difficult.
Any other questions? Oh, there's quite a lot of space.
Kevin Dalton Johnson, teaching in Manchester. You had me when you mentioned Betty Davis, to be quite honest. And there's so much to unpack, but I have 2 questions. A lot of what the examples you were referring to were from the Western canon.
Yeah.
So how would this work outside of the Western canon?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, this is all theory in the tradition of 18th century German philosophy, without a doubt. Right? And so I think that actually I'm working on that. Yeah, right now. So I've been spending some time on a project in Samoa, in the Pacific, where society is quite unlike Western society, yes. All sorts of reasons, and ways in which representations are, the significance of certain types of thinking about representations of all sorts, and how those relationships are productive of changing and entrenching social conditions. Absolutely. So I think that this is classic. Even though I'm trying to get away from reification, in a sense, what I'm arguing is that folks in the 20th century art historical and art theoretical canon, the Western one, have misunderstood kind of Hegel.
Yeah.
But then at certain points you think, well, so what? There are other ways of going about this. Yeah. Also longer traditions.
But following on from that, what about the different purposes?
Yeah, absolutely.
For example,
completely.
Art therapy, self-expression, where there isn't necessarily a goal, because the goal is achieved just by engaging with.
I like it. So I like because it's the aetiological kind of characterizations are slippery because goal directedness, because the goal belongs to the drawing. And the drawing produces the goal, and that's this thing about failure, is that there's no problem with it not doing what you thought it was going to do, or it going somewhere else, because each drawing changes the situation. And so the goal directedness is about entering into this relationship of making those changes, understanding and sharing those changes, and those are very different. And that's where I find connections with non-Western ways of thinking about what a drawing might be or what a representation is. And maybe that's a key to the teaching aspect as well.
Thank you.
Yeah. Time out.
I think that's meaning we've no more time for questions. Sorry, everybody.
Thank you. Like the intellectual guillotine throughout the day. It's just like as soon as we dig into stuff, it's time for coffee.
Yeah, carry on the conversations with Simon over coffee. Thank you ever so much, Simon.